I mentioned this morning, about the age-related loss of muscle mass. Sarcopenia is an inevitable condition to which we all succumb, but this is not really bad news because there is lots of ways that we can, compensate. Now, of course, I just to remind you that sarcopenia is the age-related loss of muscle mass. So effectively, between 30 years of age and 80, we lose about 40% of muscle mass, and these are accompanied also by infiltration of fat. From a quantitative point of view, of course, this process starts quite early, both in men and women. As you can see, after the age of 40, there is a continuous progression of loss of muscle mass. The problem, of course, is greater for women than for men, for two reasons. Women start with a lower muscle mass than men, and also they live longer, so they are more likely to spend the last year of their life in a dependent status compared to men. So it is very important to think of also solutions to deal with this problem. And of course, together with the loss of muscle mass, there is a concomitant decrease in muscle strength. And I'd like to point out, that the decrease in muscle strength in both men and women is far greater than the loss of muscle mass, and I will come to that later. And because of this association between the loss of muscle mass and strength, the World Health Organizations now define sarcopenia as the age of loss of muscle mass and physical function. And of course, lifestyle can heavily impact on the way we age in terms of musculoskeletal aging. And of course, this has been mentioned before, that somebody who is fit at the age of 80 can have the same strength, the same performance of an unfit person of 40. So in other words, just by keeping fit, we can increase biological lifespan by 40 years. Unfortunately, not chronic age, but at least biological age. And therefore, the current definition of sarcopenia is sarcopenia will limit the mobility, and this is defined as a person with a loss of muscle mass, with a muscle loss, and whose walking speed is less than 1 meter per second. Now, this is important because mobility is the essential task that we need to maintain with age. We need to maintain mobility. This is far more important than maintaining muscle mass per se. We don't need big muscles, but we need good muscles to make us move. Now, the European working group on sarcopenia defined again sarcopenia as the age-related loss of muscle mass and function, but they refined, at least they thought they refined, the walking speed as a threshold to 0.8 meters per second. And I think this approach is problematic. So basically nowadays, to diagnose sarcopenia, they measure gait. If the gait is less than 0.8 meters per second, they say, okay, this person is possibly sarcopenic, so they measure hand grip, strength. If it is more normal, that is to say a strength greater than 22 kilos, then they conclude there is no sarcopenia. If it is the strength is lower, then yes, it is possibly sarcopenic, and therefore we measure muscle mass using bioelectrical impedance. If it is low, then the person is sarcopenic. If it is normal, it is not sarcopenic. If instead the person has a walking speed of less than 0.8 meters per second, then of course it has to go through directly to the measure of muscle mass. And again, if it is low, it is sarcopenic. If it is normal, it is constant. But I used this criterion because I thought it was a nice algorithm for diagnosing sarcopenia, but actually it doesn't work. Because you actually screen for frailty, not sarcopenia. If you choose an independent population of elderly people, they all walk at a speed of greater than 0.8 meters per second. So I think the previous definition of Morley of 1 meter per second is better. But so this is an open issue. Now, what about the causes of sarcopenia? Unfortunately, this slide is complicated, but we are complicated. So I'll try to simplify it for you. Basically, it is a multifactorial problem. It is caused by, most of all, by neuroendocrine changes, by a decrease in physical activity. Elderly people tend to be less active. By changes in nutrition. We heard this morning that elderly people become anabolic resistant. Also, anorexia of aging is a common problem. Also, there is increasing oxidative stress in old age. And also there are important immunological changes. All these factors activate a series of cellular processes that activate the pathways leading to the breakdown of protein and reduce the pathways leading to an increase in protein synthesis. So obviously, to maintain muscle mass, we need a balance between protein synthesis and breakdown. So essentially, all these factors contribute to decrease protein synthesis and increase protein breakdown. That's why we undergo sarcopenia. And I mentioned this today, that the primary driver of this process is the neuropathic changes leading to loss of motor units. We lose about 75 motor units between 20 and 80 years of age. And this is caused by oxidative stress, which triggers protein breakdown and reduces protein synthesis, and also increases apoptosis, so cell death. Now, one key feature about weakness in old age is that the weakness is not only due to a decrease in muscle mass, but the muscle becomes intrinsically weaker. This graph shows, this is a very large study done in Baltimore by the group of Luigi Ferrucci et al. Basically, they collected muscle mass data on thousands of people by MRI, and also muscle strength data. And you can see that at the age of 80, the loss of muscle strength is about 4-fold greater than the loss of muscle mass. So as we age, we become intrinsically weaker. So why are we becoming intrinsically weaker? Why are our muscles for the same cross-section area become weaker? This is a big problem. One problem could be that our ability to activate our muscle through the nervous system is reduced. So there is a reduction in voluntary activation of motor units, and this which we can test experimentally in the lab. And in fact, when we measure this, the ability to activate motor units in young people and elderly people, you can see elderly people have a reduction of about 20% in their ability to activate the motor units. So that this is the neurological activation of motor units is reduced. Also, the excitability of motor neurons is reduced. We can test this by testing what is through a neurological test called the Hoffman reflex, which is used in neurology. So basically, this test tests the excitability of motor units. So again, here this test shows that as we age, there is a progressive reduction in the excitability of motor neurons. But also, there are changes not only in the size of the muscle, but also in the architecture of the muscle. Using ultrasound, we can measure distinct features of muscles with respect to the alignment and the spatial orientation of muscle fibers inside the muscle. If we place an ultrasound probe on somebody's leg, we can identify the superficial and deep aponeurosis. So these are longitudinal section. These are the muscle fibers. And so we can measure the length of the muscle fibers and also the angle of insertion into the tendon, which is called angle of venation, and also the muscle thickness. So as we age, we see that sarcopenia, here is we plot a cross-section area and volume in elderly and young people. And you can see that obviously the elderly are sarcopenic, they have a 25% reduction in volume, muscle volume, but this occurs together with a shortening of the length of muscle fibers and a decrease in the pennation angle. So this becomes shorter and this becomes lesser. Now, why am I pointing this? Because the muscle architecture is the key determinant of muscle function. The length of muscle fibers, the thickness of the muscle dictates the number of contractile elements, the sarcomere is in parallel, so how much force the muscle can generate. Now, so just by knowing a bit of anatomy and physiology, we can deduce that a decrease in the fascicle, in the length of the fascicles, and a decrease in the pennation angle, and therefore thickness of the muscle, predict a decrease in velocity and a decrease in force. Does this occur in vivo? Yes, it does, and I will show this in a minute. Now, and of course this contributes to muscle weakness. But even when we take into account all these factors that I mentioned before, so a reduction in cross-section area, a reduction in ability to activate your motor units, the difference between activation and coactivation, there is still a reduction in force per cross-section area. So, in other words, this concept that the elderly muscle is intrinsically weaker is still there. So, maybe this is due to changes in the muscle fibers themselves. Indeed, it is. If we measure the strength of per cross-section area of single muscle fibers, in the fast fibers and the slow fibers from muscle biopsies, this is the data for young people, this is the data for elderly active, and this is elderly bedridden. So you can see that in jumping from young to old, we reduce muscle strength per cross-section area. If we add these U's, the situation is even worse. So changes in single fibers, this intrinsic muscle weakness is present even at single fiber level. There is also a decrease in what is called an excitation-contraction coupling. So the coupling between the excitation of the muscle and the amount of calcium which is released. This is reduced. But even if we take into account of this problem, the problem still persists. So the question is, are we barking up the wrong tree? So, and so far we have thought of just muscle force as the force that the muscle exerts at its extremities. So the force that muscle transmits to the tendon. But actually, muscles are able to transmit force also laterally. And I will show you what I mean. This is a muscle, and this is its tendon, on either side. So normally, what we measure in the lab is, and also in vivo, is the force transmitted longitudinally. But muscle contains, at various points of its length, rings that wrap the muscle. These are like the metal rings that go around the barrel, a wine barrel. Yeah? These are called costomeres. And these costomeres are able to transmit the force-generated muscle fibers laterally through the muscle, to the adjacent muscle fiber, and eventually to the tendon. So, and the costomeres are made of many types of extracellular matrix proteins, lots of types of collagen, and other proteins that are involved in mechanical transmission. Now, the evidence that force is transmitted laterally comes from this experiment in a rat. The extensor digitorum longus in the rat is a muscle with 4 tendons. So in this experiment, they measure the force developed by the whole muscle, the intact muscle, so with 4 tendons attached, as a function of the length. As you can see, this is the maximum force developed by the intact muscles. You cut one tendon, there is no difference in force. So you would expect that if you cut one tendon out of 4, the force is reduced by at least 25%. No difference. You cut 2 tendons, you would expect the force to drop at least 50%. No, still 90% of the force is transmitted. You cut 3 tendons, so the muscle is transmitting force only through 1 tendon. No, the force is still 80%. So that means that a lot of force is transmitted not longitudinally, but laterally. And it has been estimated that about 80 to 50% of the force can be transmitted laterally. Further evidence of this comes from this experiment that shows that if you measure the force developed by a single muscle fibers and a fiber bundle, so a group of fibers connected together by their own connective tissue, you measure this force. This is the force of a single fiber, and this is the force of a bundle of fibers. So with the fibers with their own connective tissue. Now if you take this bundle of fibers, you take out the connective tissue, but maintain the same number of fibers, you have this what is called a fiber group, and this is the force which is developed. So you can see that if you take out the connective tissue, force drops by about 80%. So this shows that a lot of force is transmitted laterally. And lastly, this experiment done in vivo in rats again shows that in young rats, about 50% of the force is transmitted longitudinally and 50% is transmitted laterally. In old and very old rats, you can see that much less force is transmitted laterally, and proportionately more force is transmitted longitudinally. So there is a loss of force transmission laterally. So what I'm arguing is that perhaps some of the weakness that we measure in vivo in old age is due to changes in connective tissue, and this weakness has not been accounted for so far. Of course, so far we talked about activity, but as I mentioned that elderly people are inactive. They tend to be more inactive than young people. And this is, I don't have time now because time is running short, but this graph shows basically that elderly people have often lower than minimum levels, reach lower than minimum levels of the prescribed recommendation of the ACM of 30 minutes per day of physical activity. And of course, if we are physically inactive, of course, the muscle atrophies, and you should remember that the muscle is the biggest disposal site of circulating glucose. So we are more likely to develop insulin resistance. And in fact, if we take young people, these are young people, we cut out, we reduce the number of steps they do per day from 10,000 to 5,000 steps per day, so halving the number of steps they do per day. And we double the amount of calories they take in just 3 days of this beautiful treatment, they become insulin insensitive. So we are condemned to be physically active. This is the key message. So, and of course, if we, in addition to that, we become obese, we start to develop this lovely condition called sarcopenic obesity that sets up a vicious circle by which fat infiltrates inside the muscle, increases inflammation, causes further muscle wasting. It's a vicious circle, and eventually can end up in the metabolic syndrome. I don't have time to we just mentioned this, that as we age, unfortunately inactivity has not only metabolic and muscular implications, but also there is evidence now that it can also lead to muscle denervation. This is a new concept. We can now measure the denervation in vivo by targeting this particular molecule, NCAM. If we find the presence of NCAM, we know that the muscle has been denervated. And so just by 14 days of bed rest, there is a beginning of fiber denervation. So to conclude, I think I showed you that sarcopenia is a physiological condition, but it can be exacerbated by inactivity, obesity, and disease. It has a multifactorial etiology, but seems primarily driven by neurodegenerative processes. And inactivity and overfeeding are main risk factors for inducing sarcopenic through disease atrophy and also inflammation. And chronic inactivity also probably triggers denervation. Lastly, sarcopenic muscle is intrinsically weaker, and this is due both to extrinsic factor, that is to say, reduction in neural drive and motor neuron excitability and so on, but also intrinsic factors such as reduced reduction specific tension, reduced lateral force transmission, and so on. Okay, thank you very much.